has the New York Times put the Ukrainian counteroffensive on blast. But what do they get wrong? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. It's August 6th, 2023. This is your daily Ukraine update. Let's get into it. Okay, first, we'll take a look, as always, at the control and combat maps. The only real notable changes is a adjustment outside of Robotine. You can see here it depicts previously Ukrainian forces held portions of all of these windbreaks here to the east of the town, and you can see now Russian forces counterattacking, driving them out in all but the outer edges here. So in all likelihood, there's probably not actually Ukrainian forces in this area here. Instead, they probably occupy some of this wood line and then probably are occupying these positions here in order to, of course, use fire to control this open area between the two forces. Other than that, when we look at the combat map, we can see Russian forces focusing their counterattacking efforts. Again, really just sort of disrupting Ukrainian efforts across the line outside of Kyiv, outside of Robotine, Donetsk, Avdiivka, and Bakhmut as well. Kind of unusually, we're seeing, again, some offensive action outside north of Satove. But again, I think this is primarily indicating that Russian forces are out here just really in counterattack mode. As always, guys, if you want to see the uncensored combat footage, you should check out combatvetnews.com. This is my own site that I launched basically because Patreon, YouTube, and a lot of these big tech companies are no longer quite the fans of war coverage and analysis. But if you want to support what I do, you can become a member. Any one of these tiers will get you access to the members-only videos. This is where I assess the uncensored combat footage, these kind of stuff that I can't show on YouTube or on Patreon. It's usually pretty intense, but it oftentimes gives us insights we can't get anywhere else. Most recently, we checked out a video of a Ukrainian squad clearing a Russian trench line, and you can see as they go through, they're actually picking up Russian gear and using it against the Russians themselves. It's pretty wild stuff. And if you want that, again, combatvetnews.com is the place. Okay, but let's really talk about this New York Times article. Now, I'm not subscribed to the New York Times, but I was able to find a copy and paste of the article. It's titled, of course, Ukrainian troops trained by the West stumble in battle. And what it describes is, of course, the Ukrainian counteroffensive, right? American weapons, NATO weapons, and heralded as the first vanguard of a major assault, but quickly became bogged down in Russian minefields under constant fire from artillery and helicopter gunships. It describes one unit actually getting lost, and instead of moving through an already cleared path through a minefield, driving into another minefield. It describes another unit who delayed their offensive that was supposed to start at night, and as a result, the covering artillery fire ended up alerting the Russian forces to a pending attack. So it describes these things as if they are emblematic of the larger offensive effort. But if you have tens of thousands of troops fighting, these sort of mistakes are pretty routine, even for U.S. forces, right? Things are delayed. Your vehicle breaks down. You can't get comms. You're waiting for the widget to show up, and the widget's delayed. Grid coordinates get messed up all the time. The point is that not that a good strategy will work despite human beings executing it, right? Flawed, messy, tired human beings who make mistakes. A good strategy will account for that and be flexible enough to allow that to still succeed. As we've known, Russian mistakes in especially the kind of mainstream media have really get shouted from the rooftops. And this is one of the first times we've seen a U.S. mainstream outlet acknowledge some of the failures of Ukrainian forces and their training effort. And again, I'm pro-Ukraine in the sense that I want to see them kick the Russians out of their country, but that doesn't mean that they are beyond criticism. Oftentimes, I've found their command to be sort of myopic and fixated, and prefer to take tons and tons of time to prepare instead of taking advantage of the enemy's smaller windows of their weakness. But talking more about this this article, it really maintains that the 9 Western brigades would show that the American way of warfare was superior to the Russian approach. Russians had a rigidly centralized command structure, and the Americans taught Ukrainians to empower their senior enlisted soldiers and junior officers to make quick decisions on the battlefield and to deploy combined arms tactics, right, which it describes as synchronized attacks by infantry, armor, and artillery forces. The Western officials said this approach was more efficient, and then the costly strategy of wearing down Russian forces by attrition, threatening to deplete Ukraine's, it says ammunition stocks. I think it means all of Ukraine's armed forces. And again, if you're familiar with this, if you're a fan of this channel, you know this story is something that we've talked about for a long time, right? Ukraine can't trade one-to-one with Russian forces. It needs to get big wins, and it only can do that by breaking Russian lines, creating chaos in the backfield, forcing Russian forces to retreat. And one of the things that this article, I think, fails to acknowledge, right, it says, Western trained brigades only got 4 to 6 weeks of combined arms training, and units made several mistakes at the start of the offensive that held them back. But it fails to acknowledge the fact first that these were not junior units. Now, yes, they were combined into these brigades newly formed, but these were already combat-tested troops and oftentimes combat-tested units that were brought together. 4 to 6 weeks, that's how long these brigades rotate through the National Training Center. So none of this is unusual for brigade-level combined arms training. It's very typical. And again, most U.S. units don't draw on extensive combat experience, at least anymore. And so to sit there and go, oh, this wasn't sufficient, this is, again, a NATO standard of combined arms training. It's really glaringly obvious they don't acknowledge the fact that Ukrainian troops have run a NATO offensive already. The Kharkiv offensive is a textbook NATO-style attack, right, where they penetrated through Russian lines, forced the Russians to retreat, disrupted their command, their control, their logistics systems, and they continually pushed the Russians back, never letting them settle into new defensive positions, right? And so we know that Ukraine can execute this playbook. And of course, it even quotes Zelensky acknowledging that the counteroffensive has been slow. He said, "We did have plans to start in the spring, but we didn't because we had not enough munitions and armaments and not enough properly trained brigades. Properly trained in these weapons," he said to an Aspen Security Forum. And he added, "Because we started a bit late, Russia had time to mine our lands and build several lines of defense." Again, to me, and if you've been on this channel, you know this is a little bit of excuse making. That we'll pull it up the map here. You can see that, yes, Russia built extensive fortifications. So many so that even a properly trained NATO brigade, again, would probably have a hard time breaking through this. If you were watching this in March, you would have heard me say that Ukraine should be pushing in Bakhmut, right? The enemy there was focused for months on advancing on offense. They weren't deploying mines and digging trenches. They were advancing through the city. And so if you're going to launch a counteroffensive, that's where you should have done it. Not in Zaporizhzhia, where, again, for months we saw no combat actions, almost no artillery fire. And literally instead, the Russians spent 6 months And it wasn't just a couple extra weeks. 6 months they were deploying mines, digging these trenches, pre-planning fires, and conducting a frontal assault against an entrenched enemy is a hard task. But so again, to me, you look at this and you say, hey, this is a fault of Ukraine's leadership. Their high-level strategic leaders looked at where the Russians were expecting an attack, where they were strongest. And I think they allowed the idea that Western weapons and Western training would make them invincible. And the truth is, it doesn't. It's a good strategy if you can execute it, but it isn't impermeable. And the Russians certainly looked at Iraq and Afghanistan. They said, hey, none of these forces have really figured out a way to counter mining operations. Even a handful of anti-tank mines can really disrupt NATO forces. So imagine what millions of mines can do. And still, Ukrainian forces, or Ukrainians' leadership, decided that this region, with its absolutely eye-watering fortifications, was the place to go. Despite the fact that, again, there's lots of other regions, while the terrain isn't quite as favorable, that simply don't have this sort of extensive fortification network. Again, while you can say, oh, there's all these lines here, it's not clear that these are manned in any substantive way. And that if, again, Ukrainian forces could get behind Russian forces and disrupt them, they would have a hard time achieving stability. Here, again, something similar in Bakhmut, where, yes, there's a lot of these Wagner Line fortifications, but imagine if instead of this marginal progress they had in March or April smashed through Bakhmut with the brigades they had, and tried to even just carve out all of this territory. There would be tons of Russian units that would be caught behind the advance. So I say this because, again, some of this is some of the New York Times criticism, I think, is on the money. The fact that this was they acknowledge this was a tall order, but claiming that Ukrainians don't know how to go on the offense, that they, don't fully understand how to use their equipment, that they didn't have unit cohesion. I'm pretty skeptical. I'm just pretty skeptical. I don't think that's the core cause. I think ultimately there was a failure of planning. And I think Ukraine's leadership missed the window, right? They wanted things to be perfect. But as you guys see, right, waiting for their 9 brigades haven't even all been deployed. They could have started this with 3 brigades and punched through Russian lines, especially after the intel leak. Because remember, when that intelligence leaked, it told the Russians they had nothing to worry about until June. Like there was because the timelines went out into the public. And so when that happened, that should have been a cue that Ukraine needs to push their offensive work faster and harder. And so I think ultimately, again, the New York Times criticism is broadly correct, but I think sitting there and saying, oh, it's totally the West's fault, I think, and that Ukrainians don't know how to fight or how to launch big offensives. They do. They have successfully. So the question is, what was different in this counteroffensive? And again, the answer to me is Ukraine's leadership believed that the Russians could not, with no amount of time, could stop their offensive work. I think they ultimately ran this offensive like a Soviet offensive. They launched from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 axes of advance. You can't have a 9-brigade offensive and spread those brigades among 5 different points where you're pushing. It's just not mathematically or operationally feasible. You want them to be a spear. You don't want them to be a club. And so, again, I think seeing the New York Times put them on blast might be not the worst thing in the world. I think going back to the drawing board a little bit on this offensive should be something Ukraine's leadership should strongly consider. But ultimately, again, the fault should not be placed, I think, on Ukrainian soldiers who are experienced, well-equipped, and do have a track record of launching quality, effective offensive operations. Anyway, guys, that's all I had for you. Thank you, as always, to our Colonel tier members of Combat Vet News, and thank you to our Lieutenant tier members. I couldn't do this without you guys. I appreciate you so much, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.